Okay, welcome back. The last few lectures we talked about passing parameters and returning parameters. How do you get data into a function? The function, of course, does some computation, and then how do you send parameters back? And today we're going to talk about something related, which is the difference between local and global variables. And again, as with parameters, we've been doing this implicitly but not explicitly, and now we're going to define it explicitly. All right, so let's dig in. So again, I'm going to talk about the difference between a local variable and a global variable, which has to do with the scope with which a variable is visible to functions and the main body of the code. So let's just go ahead and start by looking at this little bit of code here. I'm defining a function called some function, no parameters coming in, no return statement, so we're just back to sort of a simple function that we did in the first few weeks. This function defines a variable called x. It assigns it the value 4 and then prints that value. Doesn't return it, but prints it. Okay. So I'm going to call this function. So that's the function definition. We're going to go ahead and call the function. We come up here, evaluate the assignment operator, print x, and come back down. And what happens now when I say print x? So this print x, of course, prints 4. That's the value of x. So what happens right here? Well, think about it for a second. So what happens is that is an error. And the reason why it's an error is that the scope of this variable is local to the function in which it is being defined. So this is called a local variable. The only body of code that has access to this value of x is this function, and it's fleeting, it's temporary. So when I call this sum function, we come up here, we assign an operator, we print, and then it's gone. It's annihilated. It's no longer present, which is why we can't see it here, but also just because the scope is only within here, and it's only alive each time we call the function. So variables embedded inside of a function definition are local or have scope to only that function and are not visible either in another function or outside in the main part of the code. Good. So that, and we've been doing this for a while now. I'm just defining this to be a local variable. Okay. Let's look over here what we have happening here now. I have a new function called printx. What is it going to do? It's defining something new here. It says global x. I'll come back to what that global means in a minute. X equals x plus 1 print x. Okay, we don't know what that line is right here, but we know what this line is and what this line is. All right, let's go down to the main body outside of the function definition. I define x to be 5. This variable x is not inside of a function. Yeah, so it is accessible or visible to all the code below us that is not inside of a function definition. So that's the definition of a global variable. Okay, so now I'm going to make two calls to print x, print x, print x. And so let's come up here. And so what this line of code is saying is that this body of code inside of a function wants to modify, that word is really important here, you're going to see that in a minute, wants to modify a variable defined outside. And the reason we have to say x is global is because Python says, you know what, these variables are a little dangerous because you got all these functions all over the place. And I need you to know, I need to know that you are modifying a global variable. So it forces you to put in that statement global x, which acknowledges that you know what you're about to do, modifying a global variable. And why is that? Why does that seem dangerous? Well, because this is some function, and I don't know who calls that function, and it's modifying a variable that has scope beyond this. It has scope everywhere. And so if this little function is going to make a change to a variable that affects everybody downstream, we feel like there may be an unintended consequence, and we are going to force you to define that x is a global variable, and that way I know what you're doing. And notice here, I am changing the value. So I'm going to say x is equal to x plus 1, print x. All right, so first call of the function, what happens? X is 5, print x. We come up into here. We say x is global. We modify the value of now a global variable. X is 6, we print x, and that's what we see on the output. Good, right there. Call the function again. What is the value of x now? It is 6, right? So that is a global variable. So I've changed its value. So come back up, increment x by 1, it is now 7. And when I print x, of course, I get a 7. So look at the difference between this line of code and the previous function. The previous function assigned a value of x inside of the body of the function that is a local variable. This x was defined outside. I define it to be a global variable here, and I can change it, and then a function changes the value of a variable for everybody downstream. Okay, so that is a global variable. Okay, now what would have happened if I didn't have that one line of code. So I've left it there just so you can see it, but I've now commented out. So same thing, x is equal to 5, print x, x is equal to x plus 1. So you think, well, I mean, this is still a global variable. I'm going to go ahead and change the value. But no, Python won't let you. You will get an error, and it will say something like local variable reference before assignment. So what happens here is you come to this line of code, and what Python says is, well, let's do it without the comment. So without the comment, you come to this line of code, and Python says, x is a global variable. Let's go get its value from down below. But now you haven't defined it to be a global variable. And so when you go to modify this value, it doesn't know what it is. Okay? And so you have an error. So if you want to modify a variable, listen to that. I'm going to show you in a second why that modification is important. You must define it to be a global variable. Now, imagine I just had one line of code in this function. So I'm going to comment out global x. I'm going to comment out x equals x plus 1. And I print x. And now I call this, what happens? Well, in fact, it now prints 5. It's perfectly happy to do that. Why? I'm not trying to modify the variable. I'm only trying to access it. So here it is. Local variables are defined and used inside of a function, and that is the scope of the local variable. Global variables can be used inside of a function, that is, they can be printed and used in an expression or passed as a parameter, but they cannot be modified. Okay? And the idea here is that there's no harm you can really do by simply printing this or using it in an expression. The harm comes when you try to modify a variable unintentionally. And so you force this construct when you want to modify a global variable, and but you are allowed to use a global variable because the scope is everywhere. Now, having said all that, I don't actually think you should use global variables. They're lazy, they are dangerous. When you have small bits of code, they're fine. But as your code starts to get big, you can't control who is going to change these variables. And so as a general rule, you should not use global variables unless it truly is a global variable that everybody needs to see and it just makes life a lot easier. But for the most part, you should be passing values in and returning parameters values out. But I show you this construct because I think it's just important to know that this exists within Python. Now, there's some really dangerous things you can do with global variables. Here's one that should frighten you. Import from math pi, of course, being 3.14, et cetera, et cetera. Define pi to be a global variable and then reset pi to be 3. Okay? I don't like floating point numbers. I'm going to say that pi is 3. Call compute circle. Compute circle comes in here, says pi is a global variable. I'm allowed to change it, and then I can use it in an expression. And not only is pi now 3 for this expression, whenever I call any other access of that pi, which is coming from math, I will have changed its value. That's insane and not at all cool. You have to be very, very careful with these global variables, because if you make a change to it in some little function in your code and it wasn't intended, there's downstream going to be a ripple effect that you have to worry a great deal about. Okay. Here's one weird little thing that I just want to point out, because it's possible that local and global variables interfere with each other. So let's see what we have here. We have x equals 1. That's a global variable. It's outside the function definition. I'm calling test with x as a local parameter. Global variable outside, local parameter inside. And then I'm defining x to be global, and now Python is confused. It doesn't know which x you're referring to here, and you will get an error because it's confusing this global and local variable. So you want to be very careful. The thing I like to do when I'm forced to use global variables is always make them uppercase letters. That way I know when I see an uppercase variable, it's a global variable. And I try to keep my local variables as lowercase level. That's just sort of a little mnemonic you can do to make sure you don't collide. So these things you have to be very careful with the naming, particularly when you're going across local and global variables. Okay, good. So we've seen more or less all that. That global construct was the new part of it. And again, I don't think you should be using them. I introduced them because it's built into Python. You should know about it. But for the most part, you should avoid using global variables and changing those variables inside of functions because there's dangerous side effects downstream. All right, there's 2 more segments to this one lecture, and we're going to change subjects a little bit, and we're going to talk about file I/O and a little bit of data visualization that you're going to need for a couple of your assignments coming up. So when we come back, we're gonna pop into Jupyter Notebook, and we're going to do a little bit of file input output. So I'll see you in a few minutes.